Welcome to PCMC, Pop Culture Man Children. So if this is your first episode of PCMC, welcome. I'm the host, Mike Bongiorno. Usually I have one of my confidants, friends, contributors here to give me their brilliant insight and discuss with me. But today is just me flying solo. So since it's just me alone, I have the opportunity to be my maudlin self and get kind of misty-eyed. Today's episode, I'm covering a documentary from 2019 called Looking for Leia. Before I get to the topic, though, since it's just us talking, I did want to talk a little bit about this podcast. Pop Culture Man Children is what I call a one-stop shop for non-toxic fandom and pop culture ephemera, from the nostalgic to the contemporary, from the old to the new. This is a podcast that has the word man in the title, which originally came from me and the original permanent co-host, Emilio Sparks, who still is a contributor. When we started it, we used the term man children to describe us as older guys who were still very obsessed with, nostalgic things from our childhood. But in the time since the show has been on, which is, I think around 8 or 9 years, the manosphere has emerged, and there's a lot of people in the podcast space, like Joe Rogan and many of his disciples, that use this space as a way of talking about misogynistic viewpoints, white nationalist viewpoints, a lot of really heinous stuff. So sometimes I worry that people will see the title and think that Pop Culture Man Children is about men, whatever that means, and there's only 4 men. That's not true. In fact, we have many, many viewpoints. I, myself, am a cisgendered heterosexual male, but amongst the many contributors to the show, we have people who are gay, bi, genderqueer, women, people of color, people of all different walks of life, because they're all welcome at PCMC. And we use the term PCMC a lot because of this. It's kind of like the way in the 90s when non-fat diets got really popular. So Kentucky Fried Chicken started calling itself KFC. That's sort of one of the reasons why we say PCMC more than Pop Culture Man Children. But I'm not totally ashamed of it. I do like the title Pop Culture Man Children. I just worry that people get the wrong idea about it. Everybody's welcome at PCMC. This is about fandom, and it's about loving things, which leads us into today's topic, because today's topic is about loving things. Looking for Leia is a 2019 docu-series. It was an online series. It has 7 episodes. The episodes are around 10 to 15 minutes each. They were independently produced by director Annalise Ophelian and played at film festivals, and then was eventually acquired by Sci-Fi, SYFI, like the Sci-Fi cable channel and online website. And they released the 7 episodes on their website, but also on YouTube and various other platforms, and then aired 2 of the 7 episodes back to back on the Sci-Fi network. When I was a kid, Sci-Fi was a big deal to me. And when I say that, I mean the channel. But when I was a kid, it was spelled SCIFI, like it's typically spelled. And when I was a kid, there wasn't a ton of stuff on it. There was Twilight Zone reruns. There was In the Morning Thunderbirds, which was the marionette puppet show, which if you've ever seen Team America World Police is kind of a parody of that. Some anime, a lot of just like kind of weird list kind of shows and stuff. It was really kind of a cheap affair back then. But I loved it as a young nerd. I remember in the late 90s, early 2000s, when they wanted to brand themselves and they couldn't use the spelling SCIFI because that's just, the name of a genre. So they became SIFI, which people my age still kind of cringe at. I mean, I don't know. It's just a little, I get it. I get it. I'm okay with it more now. But anyway, there was a time where Sci-Fi, I'm an old man. I'm 40. I'm 42 years old. I was born in 1983. And, I was on the internet, but, this was internet 1.0. So sci-fi was an important place for science fiction fantasy fandom before the sort of social internet. Anyway, so Looking for Leia is a documentary about women and marginalized Star Wars fandom. The stereotype about sci-fi fandom and also Star Wars fandom in particular, or Star Trek fandom, is that this is the province of men or straight white men. That's the stereotype. But what we learn in this documentary is that there have been women and people of color and queer people as part of Star Trek. Sorry, as part of I've created oh my God, I just did the most mortal sin. I said Star Trek when I meant Star Wars. Oh no, I'm going to lose they're going to take my podcast away. There have been, there are non-white, non-male people, non-straight people, part of Star Wars fandom since the very beginning. It's really amazing because you think Star Wars fandom, or I thought I knew Star Wars fandom very well, but there are these big gaps in the history of the fandom that's really kind of disconcerting. So of the 7 episodes, all 7 are directed by this Annalise Ophelian, and some of them get into really cool specific things. So I kind of want to talk about them all and talk about how it relates to me. What I really liked about this doc series is it really spoke to what I think of as the ethos of PCMC. It's about the importance of fandom in a person's life, partially as an escape, but not really as escapism, as a way of understanding the world, as a way of thinking about your place in the world, as a way of helping build identity, as everything is really. I've taught a lot of classes on communications and media culture. So some of what I'm going to talk about today is stuff that I've talked about a million times because I would do a lecture on fandom, but I think it's a good place to start. Fandom, well, the word fan comes from the Latin word fanaticus, which you can look up various different translations of what this means, but almost all of them come back to the idea of religion and zealotry, having something to do with like devout to the temple is one translation. And when you think about it, and I don't mean this in an insulting way, I mean this in a positive way, almost all major religions operate the same way as fandoms, or you could say all fandoms operate the same way as religions, which is that there's a text at the heart of it. And the ideology of the religion comes from a constant consumption and interpretation of the text. So obviously with Jewish people, it's the Old Testament. With Christian people, it's both the Old and the New Testament, the Bible. You've got the Quran for Muslim people. Even with Buddhism, you've got the diaries of Buddha or works of Buddha. There's always a text at the middle of it. So it sort of works in that way. At the heart of the way fans see the world, there are these texts. And I should say another stereotype about fandom is that fans are sort of immature people that don't see the difference between reality and fantasy. And they live in a fantasy world. Well, again, I'm not trying to be insulting, but if you compare fandom to religion, these people operate the same way, but I know that Star Wars isn't real, whereas many people devout of whatever religion often have a belief that the myths of their religion actually happened. The sort of father of fandom studies is an academic named Henry Jenkins. And in the early 90s, he wrote a book called Textual Poachers. The term poachers means that fans will take a text. In his book, he focused a lot on Star Trek, which was one of the first kind of fandoms as we think of it. And you poach it, meaning you read through the text, you consume it, but it's not just a passive consumption. You're looking for values, you're looking for ideas that then inform your perspective on the world. This is why we've seen a contemporary argument online, often in the YouTube space, of people wondering how there are so many far-right conservatives who are fans of these popular texts. Like, how is Elon Musk a Star Trek fan? I'd like to point out a great video by a YouTube channel named Pride Brary, Pridebray, and they just did a video called Why Fascists Love Stories That Hate Them. It's a really interesting video that looks at contemporary Star Wars, Star Trek, and Superman and wonders why there are so many people who consider themselves fans of these texts but say they don't like it because it's woke. I don't necessarily agree with all of the conclusions that this video comes to, but I think it's a really interesting topic. But anyway, textual poaching. So Henry Jenkins comes up with this idea in the early 90s, and again, this is like pre-social internet. So it's really interesting because I think he was 100% right, because I do think that's what you see. And also the idea of sort of like oppositional reading something, not just poaching from it, but reading it in a way that may not be its intended way. I think one of the biggest fandoms for this is My Little Pony fandom, which has become, it's really kind of, I'm sure it still exists, but it's not what it once was, going back 10 years or so. It had a huge impact, I think, on fandom. I don't know if it in particular remains the way it did, but that was sort of oppositional in the fact that it was about reading and finding value in poaching a text that was not meant for you, that was meant not just for a largely female child audience, but also as a consumer thing, saying I'm finding value in something that's supposed to be valueless. This gets, and I'm sorry if I'm getting too academic today, but that's what happens when you leave me alone. This relates a little bit to Judith Butler's gender trouble and her concept of trouble, which is part of a sort of performative way of disrupting the system. There was a sort of gleefulness in bronies, male fans of My Little Pony, in how disruptive it was that they were assigning importance to My Little Pony Friendship is Magic. But anyway, let's get more into looking for Leia. Episode 1 is called It's a Whole Galaxy. This is sort of an introduction to the entire doc series. There's a lot of great footage of women of all ages doing Star Wars cosplay. And you do see women of all ages, all body types, cosplaying as all different kinds of Star Wars characters. A lot of this footage is shot at Comic-Cons. The narrator has a really interesting line. Quote, "There's something amazing that happens when you ask somebody why they love a thing, and then lean in and listen. Loving a thing is an act of connection, but it's also an act of seeking, of looking for ourselves, each other. We can't love a story without looking for ourselves in that story. Imagine yourselves in greater worlds, and when we do that, we create something new." So, going back a second to Henry Jenkins, his concept was all about extracting meaning from consumption. But I think what you see in our contemporary media landscape, with our, huge ability to create in a way that's much easier than in prior generations, there's a lot of production, right? This very podcast is production. I'm a huge fan. I've been a huge fan all my life. And one of the ways that I exercise that fandom is through producing PCMC with my dear friends and contributors, because I know they also think like me and have conversations like I have and value these things the way that I do. So just talking a little bit about the actual form of the documentary, it's got a very kind of simple touch to it. It's got a very acoustic aesthetic. A lot of the music is very, very gentle, very twee. In this first episode, you hear a lot of John Williams Star Wars themes, but they're all done through a cappella. So it's got that human voice, which is perfect because this documentary is so much about people making things, or recreating the things that they love. Even the films themselves are not really shown very often. A lot of what you see is the ephemeral stuff, like Star Wars action figures, t-shirts, Star Wars fan art, things like that. which really gives this documentary a DIY feeling to it, which is really kind of nice. A lot of the interviewees in this film are, well, a lot of them are women, but some are genderqueer people, a lot of people of color. A lot of them are makers. So a lot of them are podcasters. A lot of them are droid makers or fan artists and things like that. So there's not a ton of professionals. There's some interviews with Charlie Jane Anders, who is a great science fiction writer, but they too are a fan. They are one of the creators of IO9, which before it was bought by Gizmodo was a great fan website. It's okay now. It's okay-ish now. Let me do a little side note tangent about podcasts. So the joke about podcasts are that everyone has them. It's like jury duty. Everyone has to do a podcast. And that there's a lot of people in the podcast space that no one needs to hear from. And I say this as a white cisgendered male. Like, no one needs my fucking point of view, right? But I don't think I don't make my podcast under the assumption that anyone needs my point of view. What I think about podcasts is this is a weird thought. But when I imagine podcasts in my mind, I think of the concept, the sort of old school concept of a scholar. Like I think of a learned person at the end of their day writing in their journal, their leather bound journal in their study, and how wonderfully privileged it is to be learned and to be literate and to write your ideas down. That's how I see this. I don't see this necessarily as like a show that the world needs to see my show and I'm in show business. I see podcasts as this beautiful expression. And yes, it is funny that everyone and their cousin has a podcast, and that number got even worse during the pandemic when people didn't have things to do. And yes, there's almost too many podcasts to manage. There are definitely podcasts out there that might be one that you love that you have not found or may never find. But this doesn't fill me with any sort of bad feeling. I think it's absolutely wonderful that we have this democratized way of connecting. I know that PCMC is not like, we're not on any charts, but I do see consistent small numbers, which means some of you out there like this show, and I'm glad to connect with you. But I kind of would do this even if no one listened. It is a way to get our ideas out. So I get the joke of making fun of podcasts, and certainly I do it too. But I think that podcasting is a wonderful thing to have, and everything, Substacks, all things like that, YouTubers, all of that I think is wonderful. Sorry, getting back into the episode. So one of the things you see that I think is really fascinating in the cosplay angle is a sort of separation of character interest in terms of the ages that are cosplaying that way. So like many older women will be Princess Leia. Although there's Leias of all ages, Leia seems to be, she is the feminine icon of Star Wars. But you see a lot of little girls who are obsessed with Rey, and they love Rey. And Ahsoka. Ahsoka is another big one that younger people, and older people too, but it seems that the three majors are, at least when this film was produced in 2019, are Rey, Leia, and Ahsoka. I do wonder now if after the success of Andor, we'll see more Mon Mothmas. But, you do see everyone. You do see everyone, and you see gender bending cosplay as well. Or cosplay that is not really playing as a character. There's a really cool moment in this movie where we see a cosplayer who has this dress. It's this beautiful black dress that has star patterns on it. And then the front of the dress is the scroll from the first A New Hope. It's very cool. Things like that are always very cool. Oh, there's also a very sweet moment in this documentary where we see a woman who uses a wheelchair to move around, and she's turned her wheelchair into a TIE fighter, which is, I think, really beautiful and clever and cool. Let's take another side tangent. Let's talk about Rey for a second. I fucking love Rey. And I don't know if that Rey movie that they've been saying is happening is ever going to happen. There was like multiple writers. It was almost going to happen. There's always this stuff about like, is the Star Wars movie ever going to happen or not? It's like Marvel in that way. They announce something, and then it's almost like they announce it just to see what your reaction will be, and then produce it based on whether or not you reacted the way they wanted. I do think that under all of the negative noise online, there is a generation, and maybe they're young now, but there is a generation of people that absolutely love Rey and are clamoring for more Rey. And I think there should be more Rey. I know that Galaxy's Edge in Disneyland and Disney World has unlocked the order in which, the originally Galaxy's Edge was locked in this very specific time period between The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker. And so they've unlocked it so they could get the Mandalorian in there and Luke and Leia, and that's cool, that's fine. But I don't want them to fully move away from Rey, because I think Rey is, very successful. I do think that because Rise of Skywalker sucks so very, very badly, that Rey didn't get the end that she deserves. But if we keep making Rey stuff, we can give Rey the opportunity to do more. In this first episode, we see a interview with a podcaster named Meg Humphrey, and she talks about how there's so much Star Wars stuff. Besides the films, there's the expanded universe and the books and the comics and the toys and the video games. And in fact, you don't have to like it all, right? There's too much for you to like it all. Some of it will speak to you, some of it won't. And the way she puts it in a very political way is, not a political way, she puts it in a very polite way, is that some of the hurt feelings we seem to get is from this idea that it all has to speak to you. And it doesn't. It's impossible to like everything that is Star Wars. As I record this is the summer of 2026, and we had maybe one of the least successful financially Star Wars movies ever, The Mandalorian Grogu. I thought it was a fun film. I had a lot of fun with it. It's certainly far from one of the worst Star Wars movies, but it didn't fail the way, like, in a controversial way, like the way Last Jedi. Well, actually, Last Jedi didn't fail. It made a lot of money, and most critics liked it. But it created this very negative discourse. Solo kind of failed, right? It didn't make as much money as they wanted, and I don't think a lot of people liked it. I can't really remember what the professional critics thought of it. But the thing about Mandalorian Grogu is it kind of like came out like a wet fart. It kind of just thumped, and no one gave a crap. And then we all moved on very quickly. I liked it, but also my identity isn't threatened if I don't like it. There's Star Wars things that come out that I just don't like. And I don't force myself to finish them too. I really didn't like Acolyte, although there were things in it that I liked. I enjoyed Obi-Wan, but it was not great. It's kind of just stupid. It's better as a what if story because of how stupid it fits into canon. But anyway, I think that is a good way of thinking about these things, which is you can't like it all. There's also an interview with these very sweet young girls that have a podcast called Sky Talkers, which is, by the way, a great name. And I looked it up. Sky Talkers is still around now as I record this, so they've persisted since the making of this documentary. They're two younger fans, but they're big prequel fans. And the prequels, when prequels first came out, it seemed like the end of Star Wars. But now the prequels are loved by there's a generation that was their entree into Star Wars. And there must be a value because it was valuable enough that it got people interested in Star Wars that then they looked for other stuff. And in their interview in this film, you see behind them, they have a coffee mug that says prequel hater tears, which is just fun. People talk about is Star Wars dead? Is Star Wars over? Looking how the prequels remain important in Star Wars fandom and an entree into Star Wars fandom, I think that it won't die. I think, there's always been, it's one of the biggest things ever, Star Wars, but I think there's popular Star Wars and there's true Star Wars fandom. And I think the fandom is actually stronger and maybe strong is not the right word, healthier. I think the fandom is actually healthier than the negative online discourse would have you believe. Okay, so episode 2 is called The Stories We Tell. This episode is, again, this is the part that I really didn't know about, which is it's about fanzines. And for you youngsters, a fanzine is a self-produced little magazine. Usually it's black and white, stapled together, very cheaply produced. And again, this is in a world before the internet. The first Star Wars fanzines happened right away, like the summer that Star Wars came out. And we should say that the fanzine thing began with Star Trek, right? Which is what Henry Jenkins was writing about. Star Trek fanzines and fan fiction was sort of there as a template. And what we learned is a lot of the Star Wars fanzines at the time that the original films were released were run by women and marginalized people, queer people, people of color. We see an interviewee named Maggie Nowakowska, who was a fan writer, an artist, and a publisher, and she's been part of Star Wars fandom since the beginning. And she brings up interesting points, which is, if you look at some of the very first fanzines, there are arguments that we still have today, like what is and what is not Star Wars, or what ought to be Star Wars and what ought to not be considered Star Wars. So those arguments continue. The documentary refers to a lot of these female publishers as our foremothers, the foremothers of Star Wars fandom. Two really important early fanzines that specifically focused on the female perspective was one called Storms and one called Organia, like Princess Leia's last name, Organa. So Organia. These women were always there in Star Wars fandom. Some of the earliest Star Wars cosplayers were females. Maggie talks about what she sees as the end of that phase of fandom, which is in the early 90s, they became this big push at Lucasfilm to start publishing novels like Heir to the Empire and stuff. And a lot of these writers, many of them women or marginalized people, said, okay, great, this is our time. So a lot of them sent in manuscripts and tried to get jobs. And Lucasfilm was like, no, we are only hiring professional writers. To which they were like, well, how do you know those people know anything about Star Wars? And the sort of the disillusionment that came from not getting access in at that point, kind of dissolved it, along with, the internet becoming a thing and the social internet after that. Sort of fanzine. There are still some fanzines, and there are some online fanzines, but the sort of world of fanzines that was very necessary for fandom in the pre-internet age is not around because the necessity isn't there anymore. Sometimes I like to imagine PCMC like a fanzine. I spend a lot of time sitting around imagining PCMC. It's a fanzine. It's the journal of a learned person. It's a lot of things in my mind. I want to give you a quote from Maggie from this episode. There are millions of Star Wars fans, which means there are millions of Star Wars universes. George Lucas gave us the bones. He gave us archetypes in that first movie, and then he went on to tell us his version, his alternative universe. I have my alternative universe, and other people have theirs. So one of the things that comes up in this documentary, and I think it's a really interesting idea. I can't agree with it or disagree with it. I just think it's an interesting idea, and I would have to think more about it before I said that I believe it's the case. But one of the things that seems to be posited in this documentary is that the more active fandom, the fan writing, the fan films, the fan fiction, the fan art, the fan jewelry, all that stuff, this documentary seems to posit not in a very specific way, but in a sort of subtle way that is more the province of female and marginalized fans, because those are the people that need to put in the labor of when reading it, because obviously the main character is Luke, who's a white straight guy. So for people of color or females or whoever who are watching Star Wars, there's always that extra level of labor in consuming. And because of that little gap, creativity comes. I really like this idea. I have been thinking about it a lot. Although I just don't know. Just from an academic sense, I could say I don't know if it's true yet or not. I like the idea. I'm very open to the idea. I just know that now I think a lot of people are in the producing category, not just consumption. Although that could be just because of the internet, or that could be because of our foremothers. So, I don't take anything away from that. Episode 3 is called More Than the Basement. This episode is about the stereotyping of fandom, and it's called More Than the Basement because there is the concept of the nerd in the basement having no social life, collecting toys and drinking chocolate milk or whatever, having a neck beard. I say that as I am literally in my parents' basement, surrounded by my toys, recording my podcast. So I suppose there's something to it. Although I don't fit into the stereotype in that I'm a functioning person with a real job in the world. I have a real relationship. I do know the difference between fantasy and reality. So I don't really fit into it. But this is the episode that sort of, I think, more heavily posits the thing I was just talking about, which is this episode seems to imply that the more consumptive part of fandom is more a masculine thing or a male thing, and the generative part of fandom is more female, gay, LGBTQ, marginalized because of that, as I just said, because of that sort of labor that comes with that sort of disconnect in identification, right? A white straight male watches a film that has a white straight male protagonist and they immediately see themselves, right? The media is like a mirror, right? So they immediately see themselves in the mirror, which is not true for many other people. This is a question and a problem you see in a lot of academic criticism and theory, not just with sci-fi, but also with horror. One of the big important texts in horror fandom is Men, Women, and Chainsaws by Carol J. Clover. That's where the term final girl comes from. And that whole book is based on the question of how do female audience members enjoy horror films and slasher films. So one thing we see in this episode is this idea of gatekeeping and this idea of testing, or the quote fake fangirl. Some of the women interviewees talk about how when they come across a male fan, or if the male fan sees them wearing like a Star Wars T-shirt or something, the male fan will then test them and say, "Oh well, how many rooms are in Death Star?" Or how many, basically assuming that they are somehow posing as a fan rather than meeting them with open arms as someone who likes something that they like. One of the interviewees here is someone who actually worked for Lucasfilm, and she talks about these guys questioning her and testing her when she was doing it. She was part of it, baby. She was at Lucasfilm, and I can't imagine how frustrating that would be. I know as a nerd, whenever my nerd cred is ever, questioned, it annoys me. Sometimes someone will ask me, "Have you ever seen this movie?" And it's a movie I absolutely have seen, and I'll be like, "Ha, ha, who are you asking? Of course I've seen that movie." So I can't imagine these women who their whole lives and careers and professional lives are part of this, and then still people test them. This reminds me of something that happened, God, I don't know how long ago it was now, maybe 10 years ago, less. There was a bunch of female writers for Marvel comics, not the movies. Like this wasn't like a planned thing. Like it was just women who work at Marvel Comics. They went out to lunch and they all got like milkshakes. So one of them was like, "Oh, let's take a cute picture of us with our milkshakes." And it was like, I think it was on Instagram or Twitter. And it was like, and by the way, I'm probably misremembering a lot of this, but it was like female writers of Marvel milkshake or Marvel. They may have not even said female, right? I think they might have just said, milkshake weekend or milkshake Monday or whatever. It was just them and milkshake. But the fact that they were women got that tweet just completely the sickness online of these neckbeards. The amount of men who were just hated it and said, "This is what's wrong with comics. This is what's wrong with fandom. This is woke and blah, 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 blah." All this horrible shit. And it's like, it's just these women who are having milkshakes. Like, how can you ruin a milkshake? By the way, have you ever been satisfied with the amount a milkshake is? Like, have you ever drank the last sip of a milkshake and been like, "Yeah, that was enough"? Never, right? I've never had that feeling ever in my life. I get milkshakes a lot, which, I mean, I don't mean to brag about my lifestyle, but I do have milkshakes a lot. My favorite kind of milkshake, I'm glad you asked, a banana chocolate milkshake. Here on Staten Island where I live, we have a great ice cream parlor called Eggers, and they'll make you a real banana milkshake with a banana and vanilla ice cream, and then they'll put like peanut butter syrup in it, and sometimes I like some Reese's Pieces when I'm feeling really squirrely. So whenever I drink the last sip, I always say to Jen, that's the saddest sound in the world. The last sip of a milkshake. Anyway, I've gone on a tangent. People suck. Don't test people. If someone seems to be a fan of something you're a fan of, that's a friend to you. Okay. So another thing that this episode gets into as something that they posit as more females that do it or queer people that do it, which I I assume is true, is fashion. Like people making fan made Star Wars clothing and fan made Star Wars jewelry and stuff. And there's a lot of this stuff, and it's really, really beautiful. It's really interesting, and it's also interesting because I think it comes into it relates to the concept of body autonomy. You know, to make your own clothing and your own jewelry and your own accessories is to truly own your space, to own your body as a, you know, your body is a playing field in which you are making meaning. Episode 4 is called What We Build. So this is a very specific episode. This is about droid builders, which is something way beyond my ability. It's these people that, you know, they make droids. BB-8 seems to be one of the big, you know, touchstones here. A lot of people were inspired by BB-8, and some of the interviewees in this episode are started as BB-8 builders. But what's really interesting is a lot of these people, even though this is like serious technology and serious engineering, a lot of these people aren't professional engineers, but they are part of an online community that shares things with each other and shares this technology with each other and this know-how with each other. Another thing that also makes this possible is 3D printing has made this much easier. But you see this stuff and it's so screen accurate. It's incredible. And, you know, it's truly a laborious thing. You know, it takes months, sometimes years, especially because it can be very cost prohibitive. So people will, you know, little by little build a droid and then like at the end of 2 years have like this R2-D2, which is just incredible. We learn about something called the Stardust Builders Initiative, which at the time of this documentary, this was a Facebook group specifically for women coming together to discuss their building and share plans and, you know, talk about droid building, which is just amazing. By the way, this all reminds me of Doctor Who. If you're a fan of Doctor Who, the 13th Doctor, which was the first female Doctor Who, that Doctor was very much a maker. That Doctor, their sonic screwdriver, you see that Doctor making their sonic screwdriver out of like junk and like MacGyvering it together, where most other Doctors, it's sort of the TARDIS itself kind of makes the sonic screwdriver and gives it to the Doctor. It's just interesting. The aesthetic of the 13th Doctor is very DIY, which to me relates to this idea of women as makers in fan space. Episode 5 is called What We Preserve. This is an extraordinary thing, which I had never heard of. So in 2013, Star Wars became the first major movie to be translated in Navajo. And the Navajo language is called Dene. And the interesting thing is Dene or Navajo, however you want to call it, is the most widely spoke Native American language, but it's still very small. It's still dying out. Even amongst Native Americans, even amongst Navajo tribe members, most of them can't speak Dene. So this was this project which, you know, Disney let them get it. I don't think Disney had any part in it. It seems very DIY, but I think Disney allowed it to happen. They, you know, held auditions and it's beautiful. And the movie, this documentary interviews a woman named Clarissa Yaze, who plays Princess Leia. She's the voice of Princess Leia in the Navajo version. And she's this sweet girl who talks about the importance of Princess Leia and how scared she was to fill those shoes. And then they show clips of it, and it's really, really cool. And then this other woman named Jerry Hungjiva, who is the voice of C-3PO. So, and she talks about how she went to audition for Leia, and like the room was full of like hundreds of people, hundreds of Native Americans who speak Navajo that wanted to be Princess Leia. And she was like, I don't know if I'm going to get this. And then she asked, can I audition for C-3PO? Where most of the people auditioning for C-3PO were males. And they were like, yeah. And then she got it. And they show clips of it, and it's perfect. She does it perfect. It's really interesting. They also interview someone named Jennifer Wheeler, who's one of the translators, and she talks about the difficulty of doing this because it's such a different language. And for C-3PO and R2-D2, well, R2-D2 doesn't speak, but for C-3PO and Darth Vader, it's easier because there's no lip movement to try to match. But for, any of the other characters where their lips are moving, you're trying to match at least somewhat. You're trying to make it, everyone will know that it's dubbed, but you're trying to make it a cohesive experience that doesn't completely, pull you out of it. So she talks about the difficulty in translating English into Navajo, Dene, and, the importance of the right word choice, because different words have different weights and, but also having to match the length and kind of lip movement of a lot of what's happening. It's really interesting. And then they show the premiere, which is, they premiered it in this big stadium outside, so it's under the stars, and it's this, drive-in feel, and you see all these Native American kids, and they're all dressed up, and they're all eating popcorn and watching Star Wars in their own language, and it's just really cool. And it's really cool because, as it says, as the episode's title is What We Preserve, Navajo and Dene is kind of going away. Like we see people in this episode talk about how they are Navajo, but they were taught English as a kid, and they don't speak Dene very often. So it's not just a way of giving them their due and giving them their version of Star Wars, but also using Star Wars to help preserve something so it doesn't go away. And of course, and this is beautiful because Star Wars is made in America and Navajo is an American language. So it fits perfectly. Episode 6 is called Where We See Ourselves. And this is the episode specifically about representation. And when I would teach about representation in media classes, I would always show, and this is not something that I don't think a lot of people put him in this conversation, but I would always show clips from the famous debate between William F. Buckley and James Baldwin. And James Baldwin is obviously a very important poet and writer and theorist, and important when we think about queer representation and African American representation. But he's not often brought into the conversation about like how representation works. But if you watch the debate between him and William F. Buckley, well, most people don't watch the Buckley stuff because it's stupid, but he does get into a really he has a perfect thing there. I think it's in his retort, where he describes, I think, in a very succinct way what representation is and how it affects you. Baldwin is talking about how when you're an American, you grow up watching Westerns and these cowboys and Indian movies, and Gary Cooper is the cowboy, and you root for Gary Cooper. And he says, but then you grow up and you realize you're the Indians, meaning you are the other, you are the marginalized. You were identifying with Gary Cooper, the white cowboy, but you realize that is not you. So this is why representation is so important, right? Representation, I think, people who don't care about it will say things like, this is just political correctness, or now they say wokeness, right? They act like it's just like a politeness that we're being too polite by worrying about. That fucking idiot, Jerry Seinfeld, who I can't stand him. He wants, Seinfeld has so few black characters, and people have asked him about it. Like, Seinfeld takes place in New York City, and you have so few black characters. Like why? And he, of course, in his smug way, will be like, well, we were just trying to make a comedy show. We weren't trying to fix the world, which is a complete, he's completely disavowing the importance and responsibility you have as someone making a show. I think if you're part of this magic mirror that is the media, you have some responsibility to reflect reality and to make a show that takes place in New York and have or very few black people and no black people that are in the main cast. You are creating a vision of the world. You're creating a definition of the world that is not true. And I do think that that's damaging because it's not about politeness, right? It's about, this is a mirror, and the media is not just entertainment. It is all of our information. So if you grow up in a media environment where you're surrounded by these mirrors, and by mirrors, I mean the TV screen, the computer screen, the cover of a magazine. Billboards. You're surrounded by these mirrors, and none of them reflect you. It says to you on a very sort of deep level that you don't even exist. You're invisible. So representation isn't about, oh, we're just trying to include everybody. We're trying to be, or what a lot of neckbeards now say, which is that diversity is just for money. It's just to make money. And perhaps it is on, when it comes to the decisions of executives. But the importance of diversity is saying to people, you exist. You are part of this world. Oh, I should also say, Seinfeld also like dated a teenage girl when he was a grown man, and we were fine with it. The 90s was such a fucked up time. It really was. I mean, like, the 90s, it's barely better than like the Madman 50s. Like, the 90s, like, Seinfeld dates a teenager, that's fine. Amy Fisher was a teenage girl who was basically sexually assaulted by her boss, and then her boss convinced her to kill his wife. She did it because she was a child. No, she shot her. She didn't kill her. She shot her because she was a child. And then, like, the world sided with the guy. Major newspapers called Amy Fisher the Long Island Lolita. This was a child. So the victim blaming that happened in the 90s is insane. Anyway, the important thing to understand is fuck Seinfeld. And Seinfeld's not, like, very good. Like, let's take a side note and talk about the history of comedy. I've probably talked about this before, but I'll say it again. Why not? There was a comedy boom in the 80s that began with cable television and the need for content. And that led to creating, making cheap content of comedians doing specials and episodes and stuff. And that led to more, popularity of comedy and, more comedy clubs. There are people that became famous during that time that weren't that talented. And Seinfeld is absolutely number one with a bullet, one of them. Another one, I would also say is Roseanne. I love Roseanne's original sitcom. I think it's one of the best visions of American middle class. She now has become a racist, insane, bully, disgusting person. But besides her sitcom, like, she's not a great, like, she only ever had like 10 minutes. She got famous because she went on Johnny Carson back, that meant something to go on a late night show. People were obsessed with her. She did a great job. And then, like, they built the pilot of Roseanne is based on like her 5 minutes on, performing on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. And you see that now, by the way, when you see her do stand up now, it's a lot of just like screaming and yelling and like no jokes. And it's because she never like was a great comic. Anyway, fuck Seinfeld. Going back to this episode, one of the last things this episode talks about is that the newer Star Wars films have much more diversity, than older films, and not just the new sequels, but also Rogue One and Solo and stuff. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why they're so derided. Anyway, the last episode, which is a very sweet way to go out, is episode 7. It's called How We Carry On, but Carrie is spelled Carrie, like Carrie Fisher. And this is the only episode that specifically deals with Carrie Fisher. It's called Looking for Leia, but it's about females and marginalized people in Star Wars fandom. It's not really about Leia, but this episode is about Carrie Fisher. And it's very beautiful. Someone makes the point that, there are beautiful princess characters and then there are strong female characters. And Princess Leia was the only one that was both at once. And a lot of people love Carrie Fisher for the reasons that we've talked about on this podcast, which is besides being Princess Leia, she also dealt openly with addiction and mental health issues and was a very, very funny person. So a lot of people who loved her, a lot of females who loved her and identified with her as children grew up and identified with her still because she became a very strong, adult woman. And that is, it's important. Being open about mental health and your struggles and trying to make jokes about it is something that's been very helpful to me. In this episode, we meet a woman named Barbara Lazcano who lives in Mexico City, and she is a nonprofit developmental director. And she talks about how her love of Princess Leia as a child led to her adulthood and her career in nonprofit and, working for social justice. And she tells a story about how around the time The Force Awakens comes out, her mother is diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, which is like one of the worst cancers. The survival rate is like zilch. That's a scientific term, zilch. And so she was spending a lot of time with her mother, and one of the nonprofits she was working for at the time was having a fundraiser that they tied into the opening of The Force Awakens. and her mother was a great seamstress. So she asked her mother to teach her how to make a Princess Leia costume. So they did that together. And then her mother passed away. And then Carrie Fisher passed away between The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. And she talks about how she'll still wear her Princess Leia cosplay, even just in her house, because it connects her to her mother and it reminds her of strength. It's a really sweet story to end this whole thing on. And that's it. That's the 7 episodes. They are currently available on Vimeo. You can watch them as episodes or all together as one movie that's like an hour and 25 minutes. It's very digestible. I've watched it a few times now. It's a good thing to just like throw on in the background. It makes you feel good. Especially because Star Wars fandom has become so toxic. I mean, I think it's become less so like very recently. You know, living under MAGA and Trump and everything Trump is doing to this country and this world and our people, and the sort of rise of American fascism is, you know, it's a lot. So I think Star Wars fandom has been a big part of thinking about that. And, you know, again, using a text that we love to think about contemporary problems. And, you know, I remember when Trump was elected for the second time, the speech that Obi-Wan gives to the Jedi, which comes from, where does it come from? It's from the cartoons. It's from the Rebel cartoons. The speech that he gives the Jedi, where he says, like, don't come back to the temple. The Jedi Order the Jedi Order has fallen. You know, everything's lost. The Empire is here. But one day a new hope will emerge. And people were using that audio and, you know, putting together these little clips on TikTok and YouTube. And, you know, it helped me feel better. It helped me feel better. The hope, right? That a new hope will emerge. Right now, like when Trump got reelected, it was, you know, any reasonable person remembers how it felt. The first time was insane and heartbreaking, but it was like, you were like, this has to be a fluke. And then the second time, it was like, oh God, like he won. Cause he really lost in 2020, but he really won in 2024, which means people liked him more. Some people were more for him in 2024. And, I mean, now he has the lowest, I think, approval rating of any president ever. I mean, it's a little too late, but anyway, it was very helpful. And Star Wars is very helpful to me at that time, and I think it was helpful to a lot of people. So I actually want to end this episode by reading Nemik's manifesto. So if you're a fan of Andor, in season 1, there's a character named Nemik who is part of the rebellion, but he's like he really believes in it. Even before Andor, the character believes in it. And he creates and records this manifesto, which then is used throughout the series. It's used very beautifully in the very last episode. And I see it shared a lot online now in relationship to what's happening in America and the world. So let me read it to you. There will be times when the struggle seems impossible. I know this already. Alone, unsure, dwarfed by the scale of the enemy. Remember this. Freedom is a pure idea. It occurs spontaneously and without instruction. Random acts of insurrection are occurring constantly throughout the galaxy. There are whole armies, battalions that have no idea that they've already enlisted in the cause. Remember that the frontier of the rebellion is everywhere, and even the smallest act of insurrection pushes our lines forward. And then remember this. The imperial need for control is so desperate because it is so unnatural. Tyranny requires constant effort. It breaks, it leaks. Authority is brittle. Oppression is the mask of fear. And know this, the day will come when all these skirmishes and battles, these moments of defiance, will have flooded the banks of the Empire's authority, and then there will be one too many. One single thing will break the siege. Remember this, try. Thank you for listening to Pop Culture Man Children, PCMC. We come out every single Wednesday. We cover everything. Right now we're preparing for our October Halloween time. Halloween is a big thing over here at PCMC. We do it all month long. We end every episode by saying, go bye-bye.